The other thing that I've realized that's can be tough to swallow, but I think is absolutely true is what you tell your kids is a lot less important than what they see you doing. And so they're going to see the relationship that I have with my wife and how I am in the world. And I can tell them, hey, I'll never tell a lie or blah, 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 whatever the moral is. But they're not going to learn from those words. They're going to learn from watching me exist in the world.
Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys, the podcast of great conversations with men. I'm your host, Chris Foster, and we're going to explore how we wear this beautiful and confusing mantle of manhood in the 21st century. Look, I get it. In public life, a lot of men are knuckleheads. But in private life, we can be thoughtful and we can be reflective if we have the right conversation, if we feel comfortable talking about our story. And we all have a great story to tell. And we can all learn from those stories. We can learn about who we've been, who we are, and who we want to be. And that's why we're going to have this conversation, so we can learn from other men just like us. And today we're going to talk with my friend Andrew. Andrew's got this swagger about him. A lot of that came from his father. His father was a San Francisco hippie that came out of Boston and struck out on his own and had this independence about him and a sense of his own masculinity and a sense of who he wanted to be as a man and lived that life. And Andrew learned so much about that. And this conversation is about what it's like to live with a powerhouse of a man like that and how it affects you and how you become the man you want to be, and the ideas of masculinity and manhood and how you pass it on to your own kids. It's an incredible conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys. All right, well, Andrew Melia, welcome in.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm excited to be here, buddy.
Oh, we appreciate it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I should say, first and foremost, you're not going to have me crying on your goddamn Menfolk podcast like you did our guy Johnny White.
We'll see about that, but I get
Yeah,
you.
I know we'll see about that. I'm speaking it. But I'm going to try to keep it together. Yeah, man. My name's Andrew. I was born in San Francisco, actually, and then raised in Sacramento before going on to college in UC Santa Cruz, Banana Slugs. And was able to spend a few years just kind of being a degenerate and working odd jobs in different places, which I really valued. And I think it kind of helped me on my journey for sure, before landing in San Diego because my little brother was going to SDSU. And then I wound up in the school psychology grad program there at San Diego State. And I've been a school psychologist for the last 20 years. And while I was in grad school, I met my wife, and I'm the father of two beautiful boys, a junior and a seventh grader. So that's the short form.
That's fantastic. I love that you have no regrets and actually found value in your quote unquote degenerate years and your drifty young adulthood years. I actually think that's really important because there's so much pressure, I think, for some young men to feel like as soon as they hit college, they've got to hit it and I've got to get on track and I've got to start this track at all. At the time when you were I shouldn't say drifting, you were just transitioning or whatever you want to call it. You could call it drifting. You could call it transitioning, odd jobbing, exploring, discovering, whatever phrase you want. Did you have any anxiety about that, or were you just very comfortable with where you were?
Some of the changes. So I was moving around. And so I first off, I spent a year in Boston where my father's from.
Uh-huh.
And I actually substitute taught at the school that he attended for a brief bit, St. Columbkills.
That's awesome.
And I remember very clearly walking into the teacher lounge and looking down this row of, it's like a long table of all the nuns sitting, eating their lunch. And I walked in and it just felt like that record stopping moment where like they're all looking up at me and I'm like, how is this going to go? But I spent a year there and I worked in restaurants and I substitute taught in different areas in Boston. And then spent a year in Utah, in Park City, working for my buddy in a restaurant and painting houses. And then a year in Chile, where I taught English and also worked in a restaurant. And so they were adventures in that, in a lot of those cases, I was going without really kind of having a solid plan.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when I went to Chile, that was anxiety provoking, leaving the country and not knowing anybody that I was going there, just kind of having a connection with a family that was a friend of my uncle's. But was very comfortable with the idea that I didn't need to know exactly what my path was at that time, like career professionally.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think towards the end, I started to feel a little bit more pressure to kind of figure things out, but I definitely valued that time in the moment for sure.
Yeah. Now, was your dad supportive of you doing that after school?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. If my parents ever worried about me, they didn't let me know in terms of like the decisions that I made. They were always supportive. They were always like, they kind of had this like idea, like, he'll figure it out. He's got to go.
What's so interesting about that though, is I think it actually gives a youngster a lot of confidence, right? If your folks are not like stressed about it, oh, it's about time you got a job. You graduated college 9 months ago. You better get off the dole. Or what are you doing floating around? Like all of my brothers worried about you,
Right.
and letting kind of trusting you. And in some ways, your dad trusted himself to raise you and trusted himself in how he raised you, that you were going to be okay. You were going to figure yourself out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And early on, you know what I mean? Like I guess that's one of the really sweet things about him is that he talked to me from a young age, like I was old enough to know. And
Wow.
So we had like those, kind of like man to man or adult conversations. And I felt like he trusted me to be independent from a young age. Yeah. And that made a big difference to me in terms of like going out in the world and feeling like I could do things on my own. That confidence that he had in me for sure.
Yeah, and that confidence he has in you creates confidence in yourself. And you talk about independence. It's not, a lot of people talk about financial independence, right? Or you should be on your own right now. But I guess when you're younger, clearly being supported by your family, living with your parents, etc., there is a space, I think, for intellectual and personal independence that you can still live with your family, but you know that you are an independent mind and your parents want you to have that independent mind. Is that something you think your dad instilled in you and the family as you were growing up?
Yeah, for sure. We were definitely a family that liked to argue for the sake of arguing. And I think that was part of it. It was like there was like just kind of like maybe you'd call it just intellectual sparring just for the sake of doing it sometimes.
Sure.
And so I guess that gave me a confidence in that regard, that, I could, from a young age, I felt like I could talk to adults, kind of like on an even playing field kind of way. And I don't think I had my moments of disrespect for sure, but, and I also enjoyed putting adults off a little bit, like kind of like shocking them or trying to like get them off guard a little bit, or
it's a little
able to talk.
That's like a mischievous part of you, like to do a little
and that
dig.
was definitely given to me by my dad. Like he was definitely like put the finger in the eye of authority kind of guy,
So
just for the sake of doing it.
just for doing it,
sometimes.
right? So,
Yeah.
but you just mentioned in the intro, you went to Boston and saw the school where your dad went to school, yet you were born in the San Francisco area, that Sacramento area, lived there.
Yeah.
So clearly your dad went from Boston to West Coast,
Yeah.
right? Just thinking about this now, he kind of instilled, or the impression I got is he instilled not a mandate, but kind of a family brand. Like, this is how we do things in the family, and we think independently. You got to think independently. We're going to have these conversations independently. I trust you to move into the world as a young adult independently, and you'll figure yourself out. He seemed like an independent thinker too, going from Boston and the enclaves of Boston and that whole area where his family might be from, and completely changing and uprooting his life to go to the West Coast. I mean, and San Francisco is a very specific part of the West Coast.
Absolutely.
Why
Yeah.
did he do that?
Well, so he grew up in Brighton, in Boston, and now that's a beautiful neighborhood, Boston College, and very almost posh place to live in the city of Boston.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, it was an Irish, very working class, poor neighborhood, and it was all Irish. It was a very monocultural existence for him growing up with very defined, clearly defined roles in terms of masculinity, in
Hmm.
terms of what it was to be, a man and a boy, and and I think he saw things about the racism in the city, and I think some of it he didn't see until he left, and then upon reflection was able to see things more clearly. But he definitely felt constrained by the cultural and religious restrictions that were
Hmm.
kind of like part of that community. Um, and I think he saw, people who were growing up in it and stuck in it, and he didn't want that.
Yeah.
And he had a thing where from, as long as I knew him and from people who talked to me about him in his youth, he just kind of had one of those personalities where he had a confidence in who he was. It was more like, I really like myself. I expect that you're going to like me too. And if you don't, well, fuck you. Fine. Like it's fine.
That's
Not even like
awesome.
fuck you, but like, so what?
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And, and so he just, I think, was wanting to like get out there and see more and be more. Probably goes, I mean, I'm sure you heard about free love, and that that was part of the attraction for him too.
Sure.
Knowing my pops, so I mean, he was there during, the summer of love. He was in San Francisco, so like that
Nice.
had a mystique to it too. Growing up, like I always grew up just thinking, oh my god, that period of time being there then must have
Right.
been freaking
Was a bit
amazing.
dope, right? Did he talk to
Yeah,
you
yeah,
about that? He was like, I was in San Francisco in the 60s. It's like, that's the place
absolutely.
to be.
Yeah. Yeah. The music that, the music that he got me into, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
he was, a huge, all the obvious ones, Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, all that kind of stuff. But to, feeling like he was kind of a part of that um, movement in that time. And also the political aspect of it. Like,
Sure.
he really took pride in the idea that the actions of the youth at that time is what ended the Vietnam War.
Sure.
Like that's what changed people's minds about what was going on, and so he had a real strong sense of like civic responsibility, and that
Mm.
people could change things.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's that power of
That was a very
activism.
what? Right. Sorry,
No,
I
no,
probably going to take us
don't
off course a few times.
no, you didn't. You put us on a path, right? That's a fantastic intro to learning about your dad, because he goes out as a young man, leaves the enclaves of a very tight family,
Yeah,
strikes out on his own independently, goes to truly in the truest sense of the word, a counterculture of what the culture was that he grew up in.
Mr.
And
Peanut.
uh, and the idea of him being a part of the power of activism,
Yeah.
right? And saying, you know what? Like you said at the beginning, he says always kind of, flip the bird to the man or poke eye in the idea of authority. Either he learned that or was always that way, and then he found the culture of his home and the culture where he belonged in San Francisco at that time by saying, hey, I
Yeah.
can be powerful and independent, and we as people can change things just by showing up and being vocal.
Right. Yeah. And I think it was, part of what, like, my perception of it is it was almost like, as horrible as some of the things that were going on at that time, the Vietnam War, death of leaders, the Martin Luther King, John
Oh,
F. Kennedy, Malcolm X,
right.
Robert Kennedy, as scary of a time it was in some ways, it was also felt like a time of like limitless potential. Like the future was clearly ahead of us,
Yeah.
and we had the power as people to like really define what that was going to be. And that was part of, I think, like the magic of that time. Where today we live in a very like jaded kind of society where it's like there's very little sense of our agency to be able to enact change, you know?
That is interesting too, because, and I think because of course we weren't there at the time and we have to look to our elders to describe
Yeah.
that. Clearly your dad described that. And I guess if he didn't describe it in detail, maybe he talked to you about the spirit of what that felt like, that
Yeah.
sense of agency and being able to change things. Did he do that? Did he talk about kind of, oh, I remember when, or did he speak about those experiences?
A little bit, but I think it more than, um, I mean, as opinionated as he wasn't preachy to us in that way. Like, those were the good old days, or that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. It more, I think, just informed who he was as an adult, and as a man, and how he moved around in the world, and because he had a real sense of like, um, so I mean, he went to San Francisco to go to medical school, and that's where he met my mom, and he went on to work for the state health department in maternal and child health. And, it's funny because these days, people who are in public health, everybody's very suspicious of them, right? Like they think that
Right.
they're planning like pandemics, and that they're, in the pocket of powerful interests. And my experience knowing the way that he worked was kind of the opposite. Like there was a lot of bureaucracy that he felt he had to work through to get things achieved. Um, but it was a very like passionate, research based, mixed with idealism type of thing that he was doing. It was like, this is the science, this is the medicine. It's for the betterment of our community.
The
This
public
is to
good.
make a better world, the public good. So in one sense, it was extremely idealistic, and um, but it was also just really based in what's going to work and what's going to be most efficient and what's
You,
going to
you,
have the
you know,
biggest impact.
the biggest impact, right? And because the public good, the idea of the Bentham idea of, um, the greatest good for the greatest many, right? And
Yeah.
being a part of that. Um, just in that conversation piece, we learn a lot more about your dad, where he felt confined. You talked about the school he went to with a table full of nuns,
Hmm.
and a view of the world. I'm not going to say it's cloistered in a religious sense, but cloistered in
Yeah.
in the idea that this is kind of our world and this is the boundaries of our world. You can imagine him having this spirit of belief that he can change things. Going to San Francisco, not only being part of the activist movement, like you
Yeah.
said, to help end the war, but to find a vocation and a profession where he's actively changing,
Yeah.
actively engaged in the public good.
Yeah. It was a journey for him for sure, because he also, he was went through medical school on the GI Bill, and instead of serving in Vietnam, he worked on the Sioux Indian Reservation. Um,
Wow.
and so that was a time of like extreme isolation, for him, like in a lot of ways. Like
Mm.
he was very socially isolated there. So like he's the doctor that works in this clinic and hundreds of miles. It's the only medical facility on this Sioux reservation, and and so I think that also like informed who he became in terms of his commitment
Public
to
service.
improving things, but also, um, I mean, he was a truly an ex-Catholic. Like he was as far fallen far from that tree as possible. But I think he also learned other aspects of spirituality through that,
Hmm.
and that kind of became part of him also. So it his journey's pretty amazing, and pretty like I don't
Yeah.
really know any others like it. And
Yeah.
and some of it, kind of created who he was. But like at a certain point, the thing that was so amazing about him was he was just himself. And at times, for me as his son, it made me uncomfortable
Hmm.
how confident he was in just being him.
Yeah.
And and he had some strange thing, like he was a true hippie. Like he would walk around the house butt naked all the time. Like that was just
I
like
love
friends would be over,
it. Come
like
on. Up.
and no shame, zero shame. You know what I mean? And again, it's just
Your
and that
friends would
was
come over, you'd be like, by the way, my dad's naked. They're
dude.
like, no
Yeah,
way, fucking
yeah,
Mr. Melia.
yeah, yeah. And they had a thing. This is a good one. They had a thing on Sundays, and this is another. I won't go into detail, but he and my mom would be like, "You guys got to get out of here," and that was their intimate time on Sunday afternoons.
That is
And
awesome.
we all knew, and the kids in the neighborhood knew. Like
Because you'd be over their
when
house.
pops comes, we'd be all hanging out playing Tecmo Bowl, and my dad would come downstairs and be like, "Yep, you guys all got to bounce. You guys got to get out of here." You know what I mean? And so
That's awesome.
it was awesome. I mean, in hindsight, it's incredibly awesome
Yeah,
because
it's
it
awesome.
was a committed time for them to be intimate with each other,
Yeah,
and it was also like I'm completely comfortable with whoever knowing
right.
there's no secrecy around it, and so but that goes beyond that. Like that would just be in terms of like how he would talk to my friends, how he would talk to my friends' parents, how he would talk. It was there was literally no shame and like he just didn't like perseverate on regrets. You know what I
Right.
mean? So it was just like I'm moving on to the next thing, and that was hard for me. For
I
sure it
bet.
was hard for me, and part of it was probably like, you know, I don't I don't have that level of is a kind of a corny word, but like gravitas.
Right.
Like he was definitely like a charismatic person, and it felt like a big shadow at times
I bet
because
it
of
did.
where he'd come from. Like kind of like you know built himself up on his own. Like his parents didn't really even like believe he was a doctor. They were like, "Do you really think he's a doctor? Eddie's a doctor." You know what I mean? like so he really did this on his own, and in spite of like kind of his sort of jovial and um, fun. My grandmother called him Fun Eddie because from her perception he was just out always just having fun.
We'll be right back. What I love about that is that the grandparent can look past their own kids and look at the child and say, okay, he's got it going on. I want my child to be confident. I want my grandchild to live their life, because you get to a certain age where you're like, fuck, I wish I could have been more myself. And
Yeah,
this kid's himself. And it's interesting you mentioned the intimidation of being part of that big personality.
Yeah,
I can actually see that. And I guess, you know, I guess a question I have for you now, looking back, the way you talk about him, Andrew, you really seem really proud of your dad.
for sure.
You
You're trying to
know,
do it right now. It's not going to happen, Chris.
no, I'm not trying to do it. What I'm saying though is that like you're super proud of him,
Yeah,
but I can see, especially when you're 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13,
yeah,
14, trying to figure yourself out, that there was pride, but there's an intimidation, and maybe the intimidation feeling and the shadow feeling came before the pride.
100%. Yeah, I, um, like I think most kids, I super looked up to him when I was a kid, and then when I started to become 12, 13, I started to like resent some aspects of his personality for sure, and
Mm-hmm.
some of that was out of the intimidation, and some of that was just, he was heavy handed. Like in just in the way that he interacted with others. Sometimes he would be, just go over the top with the way that he was and not being able to read the room in a way that
Mm.
made me really uncomfortable,
Yeah,
Or
I see that. I can see that completely. I especially younger, when I was younger, I struggled with, let's call it containment, right? Of, being more aware of other people's comfort level of,
Mm,
either my exuberance or extroverted nature, or I I would assume that other people had a similar comfort level than I did with certain situations, and oftentimes, trample without meaning to, right? Forgive your trespasses. We forgive those who trespass against us. But I probably did a lot of trespassing that I wasn't aware of. Um, I can
just
see
because
that.
you're saying you were like overexcited and
Yeah,
just would go for it without necessary. Yeah, yeah,
or not without reading the room or checking other
yeah,
people's comfort level.
yeah.
And as a natural extrovert, that's just something I would do. I
How
think
did
it's
you come to be aware of that though?
well, actually, the only way I became more aware of it was living and being in a relationship with my wife. She's
Yeah,
got a seventh sense about people, and she could see the goodness in me. But I think she was also like, you could do a little bit more polish, right? A little bit more polish will help, not because you want to be polished, but because it just helps other people engage a little bit more comfortably with you, right?
yeah.
And so, you know, I think what's interesting about the stories you tell about your dad is that he was not interested in being polished. He was not interested in the polish. He'd go around butt naked and be like, "Don't polish me,"
Right,
you know.
right. Yeah, no, 100%. And he was polished in the sense that he was like a public speaker and he know
Sure.
how to present himself and he know how to be charismatic. But yes, he wasn't packaging himself necessarily, for other, and honestly, I think I was more of, and probably still am more of like, a people pleaser, and
Mm-hmm.
like wanting to be liked and wanting to be, um, make others, feel, I don't know, happy, comfortable, etc. And I leaned more that way, and I probably resented the fact that he clearly didn't feel any of that, like he was free of all that. You know what I
Right.
mean?
No, he
And
was
that,
free.
for me, it was like a burden of feeling like, God, I'm nervous on a date because, I don't want to mess up. I want her to like me. All those types of anxieties that he just never seemed to have. Like he was the type, the person that flirts with the waitress without any kind of like thought of it. You know what I mean? And I would be like, gosh,
Right.
maybe that's making her uncomfortable, or maybe da, 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 and all that kind of stuff. Or like, what does
Mm-hmm.
mom think? And da, da, all that
Right. No,
kind of.
well, right. And but that's a natural thing, right? Because when you look at your parents, there's a time in your life, especially I think this is true. At least I've experienced this, and other men have experienced it, where you emulate and really admire your dad for, especially if there's this magic aura around him in terms of what he's done with his life and how other people respond to him. Then there becomes a point. It's like, you get a little bit resentful because you're a teenager. You find a way to rebel. Every teenager has to rebel at some point because it's the only way you can start detaching, right?
Yeah.
And then the idea of saying, "Gosh, Pop, maybe you're on a bit thick. Maybe you could like read the room a little bit." Fuck, it's really embarrassing when you say this waitress has beautiful eyes, or you tell her she's got great knockers and stuff. It really cringy, and I don't like it. He goes, "Well, she does. What do you mean?" Right? It's like, no, Dad, you can't. Right? You can't do that. It kind of makes everyone nervous. So I can see how you would move in that direction as a young man. And I guess one thing that you think now, and I know, sadly that your dad has passed, and I wonder now, as you look at your stages of sonhood, right? The earlier years of sonhood, when you're like, oh, Dad's kicking us out of the house, okay. Your later years of sonhood in your middle teens, where you're like, oh fuck, Dad, tone it down. I know we have to leave, but you have to let the whole neighborhood know Mom and you are getting it on, right? Really? And then right. And then you eject and go off to Boston and Utah and Chile, and you're like, oh, my dad is cool and supportive. He's letting me do my thing. Yeah. And then you start getting older and start getting settled. Do you have, can you see your different your different ways of sonhood in those transitions? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this. I'm super lucky that in spite of some of his other heavy-handedness, he was very thoughtful in our relationship. He was aware not to put too much on me, to not like be judgy, and not to. So we never fell out. Do you know what I mean? And when I did push back and say, "Hey, Pop, you're making my girlfriend," like in high school, she doesn't really like coming around the house these days. Like, maybe you can chill. And he would say like, "Yeah, man, okay." So he respected me enough to adjust, and he would never do things knowingly that would distance us. But absolutely, as you go through life, you gain a deeper appreciation of him as a father. And now that I'm a father, 10 times more.
Yeah.
And understanding the thought that went into it. And there's so many things about how he was, like, as an example, he used to always tell us, your mom, I love your mom more than you. She's the first. She's the one that I love the most. I love you guys, but she's the most important. And
that's so interesting, and in some ways so awesome, because you're like, okay, Pop, and I think
I chose her.
I chose her. I didn't choose you guys. You guys just showed up, and I chose her. But I think that lands better. I think that lands better from a father to a son, because you can be like, what, hey bro, I hope you find a woman who is your absolute world. I just hope you find this woman who's the world for you, just the way Mom is the world for me.
Yeah. And it also meant to me, like, hey, dude, if Mom's not right, this shit's not working. Right? Like, that's the priority. It was more to me like, my relationship with your mother is the thing that provides the vision, the structure, the everything. If that falls apart, none of this is making sense or working. So my priority,
get out of the house.
Yeah, exactly.
Sunday at 2:00, get out of the house. I'll see you at 5.
Yeah. So, I mean, right? Like, but that was it. That I understood, and that's something I've I've always told the boys, I'm like, mom is number one. That's the most important thing. And as a son and as a husband, that's our number one priority. And everything else comes second, because without her, this machine ain't running. You know what
That's
I mean?
yeah, that's actually I think that is such an extraordinary way to frame a marriage
Yeah.
and position a family for strength, because there's no doubt in my mind that your wife looks at that and says, I feel valued.
Yeah. 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 No, for sure, man. And I think that uh the other thing that I've realized, that's can be tough to swallow, but I think is absolutely true, is what you tell your kids is a lot less important than what they see you doing.
Yeah.
And um, and so they're going to see the relationship that I have with my wife and how I am in the world. And I can tell them, hey, I'll never tell a lie, or blah, 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 whatever the moral lesson is. But they're not going to learn from those words. They're going to learn from watching me exist in the world and how I treat, my wife, and how I, how I work. Um, and obviously that's a lot harder, because I mean, we can all read a self-help book and read it to our, quote some bullshit to our kids, but actually going out and them seeing that is hard, man. It's really hard.
Yeah,
And I
there's a
fail at it all the
pressure.
time, for sure.
No, yeah, there's a pressure of fatherhood, and you don't know what your kids are watching or picking up, and you don't know what they remember. But it seems to me that that fundamental lesson of kind of watch how I live, boys, I gotta believe that's something you learned from your pop.
Absolutely. He was, I mean, in spite of being a very opinionated person, he let us kind of do our own things. He had, obviously he had opinions, and I think he um, spoke freely to us, but it felt more like I mean, or maybe it's just in hindsight of seeing him, knowing that that's what I learned from, knowing the things
Mm-hmm.
that I valued and I took away from is how he interacted with other people, how he treated my mom. Not that they didn't have fights and tough times and
Sure.
difficult, even periods of time for them. Um, but looking at it as a whole, and his commitment to it, and the way that he talked to us, the way that he respected us.
We'll be right back. So do you now do you talk to your boys about your dad in this way, where have you shared with them some of those stories, and um because your boys are in that seventh
Yeah,
grade and a junior, this is the
in
time,
the
right?
mix, for sure. Yeah,
And
yeah,
and I'm curious because you said at the outset that your dad had different perspective of masculinity and what that looked like, and
yeah.
coming out of Boston, they had a perspective of what being a man was, but he was like, no, I can be my own man, and this is the man that I want to be. Are you talking to your sons about the man A that he was, the man that you are, and the men that they can be, without kind of laying in about the man they should be?
Yeah, probably not as explicitly as we are right
Mm-hmm.
now. Um, the stories come up here and there. Um, but it's interesting, man, because you know the title of your pod is Menfolk Journeys, and you know he was a pretty like gender roles it's a weird thing with him, and I think in terms of the way I was raised and the way I look at it now, um, like I'm kind of against them. You know what I mean? I'm kind of
Mm.
like I don't want to dictate what it means to be a man to them, and I don't know what your perspective on it is as um, through this podcast, but I was always kind of raised to feel like whatever your interests are, whatever turns you on, whatever um, piques your curiosity, that it's okay to explore that. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And that and so both my wife and I have both really raised the boys in a way where it's like, hey, whatever you're into, whoever you love, it's cool with us. And if you like painting, if you like dresses, if you like football, if you like, so it's like, um, I don't, I guess, but then I think that there's a aspect to maybe my subconscious, or just probably just being raised in, this world where I do have some, it's not like I've never told my kid, man up. You need, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
I've said
yeah,
that
yeah,
to my
yeah.
boys. So, obviously I've got some thoughts about, or feelings about, like, I don't like to see, if you're whining or complaining about something, or you're, feeling sorry for yourself, that's unmanly. And I might comment on it a way that's not that open-minded. But so I guess I'm probably conflicted in the way I present it to the boys sometimes.
Maybe, but I think the nomenclature and the phrasing has been drilled into us for so long, right? You
Yeah,
got to man up, boys. It's time to right, and that's such a common phrase that we hear all the time growing up that it's hard to kind
yeah,
of let that phrase go without actually saying this is what it means like to be a man versus a woman, and you have to
sure,
right. I don't think that works that way. I've got two daughters, and as they were growing up, I wouldn't say we threw gender roles out the door, but what we did do is we raised them as if they were boys or girls. We just raised them as children. So we would sword
yeah,
fight, we would wrestle all the
right,
time. We'd go up to the park, and it's the stupidest game, but basically it was knock dad down. So I'd get them.
yeah,
They would just run at me and try to knock me down. Right? It was
yeah,
very physical in terms of the wrestling and the engagement, and we got lacrosse gloves and these really heavy foam weapons, and would just go into it, right?
awesome,
Axes, swords, and maces and stuff like that, um, and so, but of course, they loved dresses, and they were ballet dancers and singers and things like that. So
right,
it was a mixed bag, right? It wasn't, we had to, put a gender role on them as they were growing up, and it sounds to me like that's what's happening with you and with your boys, where the they're growing up as children and people, not necessarily I'm a young boy and I've got to become a young man and this is what a man has to be. um and I
it's
gotta
definitely a different culture they're coming up in too. And
right.
in some ways, I'm hopeful that they won't, not going to feel that level of restriction. I think that we probably grew up with feeling, and certainly my father even more so grew up with
Hmm.
feeling. Um, but
Yeah,
I don't know, like in terms of your discussions on the men folk journeys, like, wh-
but
is
it's
there something? Yeah,
there's different themes, right? So I grew up in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh very much is a blended city growing up, where at the time in the 80s the steel industry was collapsing, which was a real big challenge for a lot of
yeah,
that industry and the people who worked in that industry. Yet at the same time, the University of Pittsburgh and the medical center there was uh, thriving. It was the first heart transplant at the medical center there, and the University of Pittsburgh was and Carnegie Mellon were these two anchors of intellectual freedom and thought. So it was a blended area to be a man, right? And so I worked construction in the summer, which was great. I was a mason's laborer, which is like the lowest thing on the pecking order, right? I would
hmm,
mix the mud for the mortar for the that went in between the bricks, right, and carry bricks. Right, that's what I did. I was just a bunch of men, right, just working on a
right,
construction site. And but at school, I went to a liberal arts school, and my poetry teachers were men. My painting instructor was a man. My drawing instructor was a man. Barry Shockman, he was about, I don't know, 5'2". He was like a bantamweight boxer. He only smoked cigarettes and ate crackers, from Brooklyn. This tough ass dude. But he was a drawing instructor, right? He drew like in paint, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what's a man? He's physically a man. He barks like a man. He intimidates people like a man. He smokes cigarettes like a fucking chimney, but he draws, and he's like all in, right? It's super intense. And so, as I've gotten older, the journey that men go on, I think, is pretty unique, because in 2024 we are having conversations about what these roles are, right?
Right.
And I talked with one of my guests who had a daughter and transitioned. Now he's got a son, and that's, he says, KJ is my child, right?
Yeah.
Daughter or son doesn't really matter, right? It's the child that I love. And I think that, our children, like this next generation, is much more fluid about it.
Right.
There are new phrases every day for how you describe someone's gender or sexual preferences. I can't keep up with it, and I would be disrespectful if I mentioned them all. Are your sons having those conversations with all their friends too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of just an understood part of their experience, and it's not a big deal. It's
Right.
not a big deal. But I also think at the same time, they still feel the gaze of the culture at large, or their community of kids, and it still takes courage to explore the things that you're interested in that might not match with the way maybe people think of you, or what people would typically consider a match for your gender. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I still think that's a challenge, it's still not, it wouldn't be easy for a boy to, take a ballet class, which my son did. Both of them
Right.
did.
Right.
And there was, they loved it, but there was also elements of like, I don't advertise it. You know what I mean?
Oh,
And so,
that's
yeah,
interesting. So
yeah.
they didn't advertise it. Did they get any guff from some of their from their boyfriends?
I don't think for the most part they did. No, I
Okay.
don't think for the most part they did. But there's just still that, like, I mean, I don't know, probably for you when you were getting into poetry and art, like, was that viewed in a certain way? Was that an act that took some
Well,
defending to your
it did
friends?
actually. It's funny that you tell me that, or that you mentioned that, because here's what I thought was actually very interesting. So I'm working in the construction site. They're building a house, which was awesome, right? To see a house being built, and yeah, I was the mason's laborer, but that was fine. But the chief mason who I worked for, huge dude, like Gold's Gym type of power lifter dude. Um, now looking back, I've got a different perspective of kind of why he was, but he was a total a-hole to me, because he knew that, oh yeah, I'm going to college back in the fall. This is the summer between my freshman and sophomore years of college. I just came back from my first year of college. I'm, that kind of guy, that kind of kid, right? And
He thinks you're slumming it for the summer.
think, well, and he's like, oh, you're a doctor's son. You just got this thing, and this isn't what you're doing. And he told me a lot of times, well, you're lucky. You're not going to use your back to make a living, and all this kind of stuff to make sure that, he had, I think looking back, he had to put me in my place versus where he was. And I didn't think he understood how much I respected him for what he did. Right. Because there's this thing, well, here's this educated kid who probably thinks that I'm like a dumbass, but I was like, no, this is incredible. You're building a house. And I can see, look, I've got all the respect in the world for all kinds of trade, all kinds of work, right? So if you're a software developer and you're building an app, that's cool. And you're like, oh, look at this app. I can do this ding dong thing. And it's an awesome little thing and blah, blah, blah. And then, but you're a Mason. I'm like, you're fucker. I'm building a goddamn house out of brick,
Right.
right? I'm
Right.
building, I'm making shit, right? I'm making
Right.
stuff, right? Don't disrespect me. And so, but he was very interesting because there were times when he called me flower and I was like, what? And I'm like, where's that coming from? And and it was one of those things where I was like, nah, that's not gonna fly. He goes, oh, okay, flower. It's like, no, 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 that's not gonna fly. I'm not a flower. I'm not a flower. You can shut the fuck up. And he was like, oh, okay. I guess I won't. But that was kind of his first piece, right? To kind of peg me in
Yeah, yeah,
as
yeah.
as someone who wasn't kind of the vision that he had of a man. And it's I
But
think
that's a thing. That's a thing. Not just, and maybe it's something that we are losing to a certain extent for men, women, whoever, where it's like, I'm going to test your ass. I'm going to
yeah.
see how you respond to me fucking with you. I'm going to see how you respond to me putting you in some uncomfortable situations. And you're only going to earn my respect by seeing how you respond to these tests that I'm putting you through that are admittedly cruel. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Admittedly, um, but how good does it feel to earn the respect of somebody like that?
yeah.
Like,
It
to,
did.
you know what I mean? Like, there's a
Abs-
real
it did.
win
It
getting
was a
in
real
with.
win, and there was it was actually very interesting because uh, Pittsburgh is a it's a city of neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are very distinctive, and so there's not a lot of cross pollination within a neighborhood, but everyone walks from one neighborhood to the next. And so when I first went to school, elementary school, and when I was kindergarten, I went to East Hills Elementary, and my mom was like, "You're going to go to public school." And my very first friends at the time were African Americans, right? Because it was East Hills. It was awesome. So Marvin Hodge was like one of my first friends, and it was really cool. And then as I started to get older, my dad was like, okay, I'm going to move you over to this school, where it was a very white school. And the reason I mention that is I always got along kind of with everybody, but at this construction crew, it was really interesting. Midway through the summer, a new crew came in because we had to get more work done, and it was an all African American crew. They came in. I'm telling you, the other guys did not welcome them in the way they should have. I'll just say that. But
Yeah.
I did, because I was like, yeah, what's up, dude? Blah blah blah. Just talking with them, engaging with them, just per normal, right? Because they're part of
Right.
the crew, and they knew so much more than I did, and I could learn from them about what they were doing, and they actually treated me well, right? They didn't treat me like a total like asshat. They said, oh yeah, this kid's working hard. He's
Yeah.
fish out of water, but he's trying. He's carrying bricks. He's carrying my bricks for me. Okay, that's good. and one of those guys said to me, he just looked at me, he goes, you're good. I was like, well, what do you mean? Of course I am. He goes, no, 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 no. You're good. You're good. And it was one of these things. And this other guy said, yeah, he's cool. We'll call him Chili Milk. I was like, no way. You're giving me a nickname? That's awesome. Because that was cool,
He
right?
called you chili milk.
He called me Chili Milk, right? Because I was chill and cool, and I was I was a white kid, right? So that was awesome. But I was like, all right. And it was
Oh
so
shit, Chris, that's gonna stick for sure.
but here's what's interesting. The first Mason that I was working with earlier really resented me and really stuck it to me for engaging with that. And I was like, okay,
Yeah.
this was a really interesting thing when I think about manhood, masculinity. I think about what that means. It was one of those moments when, as a young man, I mean, look, I'm freaking 19 years old, surrounded by grown men
Yeah.
that are building houses, and I was like, okay, I want to. Doesn't necessarily need to fit in because I know I'm leaving in 6-8 weeks or whatever, but I want to, like you said, I want to earn their respect. I want to
Yeah.
be in a position where I leave and they're like, okay, he did his part. He
Right.
did his part in helping build this house, right? And he was that the fact that I engaged with this other crew was something he had such a hard time with, and it really rubbed, I think, his own sense of who he was the wrong way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's something I've seen in the world also. You know what I mean? And especially, and I honestly, I mean, I think that's part of what made my father leave Boston. Is it felt like there's no room for independent thought in this
Right.
community. I'm stifled by, I'm either with you or I'm not. You know what
Right.
I mean? That really felt like the choices that were in that community and the ways of thinking. And he didn't want to have the same dumb argument, every every
And
day.
it's funny because I remember this guy, and it's so funny. I've never forgotten this. It's so funny how some of these memories, these emotion, what I know from biology, because I do presentations and I talk about marketing, the impact on the brain, and gobbledygook like
Mhm.
that. But
Mhm.
the cerebral cortex is on the outside, but the inside is the amygdala and the hippocampus. And
Yeah.
biologically, that's where emotion and long-term memory live. And biologically, those two parts of the brain are actually right next to each other, like they're touching in the core of our brain.
Mm.
So those memories and long-term memory and emotion are physically next to each other in the brain. So when we have these emotional moments, that's why we remember them. Like we all remember our first meaningful kiss. We all remember the
Right.
first time we get laid. We all remember these precious emotional moments, right? But I remembered that moment where, in that conflict that I was talking about, my first Mason said, he was singing, "Well, don't stand by me, you don't stand at all." And I was like, "Bro, what? What are we
That's,
we're getting
that's wild.
we're getting tribal now? Really?
Yeah.
It doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense."
Yeah.
And it's a thing where I don't know, it was like, to your point earlier about kind of what you remember and what those moments are of, you know, are those defining moments of masculinity? Maybe for me at that moment it was.
Yeah.
What kind of man do I want to be?
It took courage, right?
Right?
You were definitely going your own path in that moment,
Right.
and um, and there had to have been something that gave you the confidence to do that. Just like there had to have been something that gave you the confidence to pursue interests that weren't like in your prescribed path, right? Like that
Right.
wasn't what most people would tell you or what was expected from somebody from your neighborhood or from your experience. And um, I don't know what do you think in your childhood gave you that confidence that like I can pursue the things that I love, or I can pursue the beliefs that I have, and I don't need to feel constrained by
Yeah,
society or like the social groups that I'm
it's
around.
it's a good question. I think that my own father had a lot of various interests. And yes, he owned guns and we used to shoot guns all the time and blah blah blah. But he was at his heart a very sensitive man.
Yeah,
Uh, he loved poetry. He loved history. Um, he chose a path of medicine that was to psychiatry to understand how people thought and felt versus fixing knees or elbows or surgery and
right.
stuff like that, or heart surgery or something like that. And he was interested in the human condition, and had empathy for the human condition. And so that's something that I definitely saw through how he lived in his life. And the idea of having a variety of interests is something that's either baked in me, that's hardwired. It probably is,
Yeah,
but it was encouraged by my dad and my mom. Both of them have a
yeah,
variety of interests, and I think that I became more confident, I think, in my own vision of manhood when I got positive feedback for being myself, right?
yeah.
Where you figure out that you're different than other people, but if you've got the confidence in who you are and you figure out that I like myself, and you said at the beginning, your dad really liked himself. He's like,
Mhm.
he looked in the mirror. He was like, "We're cool, Ed, right? Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Ed, we're cool. We're
exactly.
cool.
Yeah, yeah.
We're
Let's go.
cool." Right? And I think that anybody who has that sense of, they call it self-possession, right?
Mm,
Anybody who appears self-possessed appears more confident, and you're okay. You might not like them, but you respect the fact that they understand themselves and they want to be themselves. I think
yeah,
that, and I think quite honestly, when you ask kind of what that means to be a man, it can be a woman too. But I just happen to be a man. Right? That's just how
mhm,
that's
yeah,
the way I was made. Right. But to me, that's the ultimate expression of, to me, being a good man is, of course, do well by others and, serve other people, but be myself.
yeah. I agree. No, I agree, and it's not easy. You know what I mean? Because I think there's so many things that impact us emotionally, or our thinking, or our attention, or our distractions that keep us from being the most honest and sincere expression of who we are.
Yeah.
And you definitely, like, and that's why I love you, my brother, and why I value our conversations, because it's not with everybody that it feels that comfortable to be yourself, right? like
Right.
like it like it's not like you're just walking around all day just having like amazing sincere interactions with every human that you interact with. And actually, my dad had a saying for it. He said it was when your feelers are out, like antenna, like you're
Hmm.
just a little bit more keyed in to what's going on around you, and you're picking up their radiations and they're picking up yours, and it's just that the energy is good. And it's not, because it's not just what you're putting out, it also has to be received, right? For
Yeah.
it to be a true expression of who you are. And um and so it's, even though that's our goal, right? It's not a perfect thing. It doesn't always come out that way. And if it's not sort of reciprocated, or that energy is not returned, it's hard to maintain it sometimes.
It is, especially it's hard to maintain with folks who either put up guardrails or try to present themselves in a way to be seen in a way that they
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
be seen, right?
yeah,
I definitely think, women of course do that too, but I think men do that a lot, where there's a need for posturing, there's a need for
sure.
um, uh, uh, hierarchy, right? There's a need for, um, you know, a friend of mine is having a challenge in his relationship, and one of the insults that was hurled was, "Oh, you just got that car for as a status symbol."
Hmm.
And it's like, maybe he did. Maybe that was the reason for it. Maybe the reason was the status, but maybe the status was so I can feel about myself the way I want to feel about myself. Or maybe is because my neighbor got this car, I'm gonna get a fucking better car.
Right, right,
I'm
right,
gonna
right,
beat that neighbor,
right.
right? So I'm not sure what the intention is of that. And I think that, to your point about these authentic conversations, it's very hard, I think, for people to feel trusting of someone else, that they will accept them for who they are versus
Mhm.
seeing somebody for who they think I should be.
Yeah, and honestly, it's it's a real effort to walk through life being truly present with all the people that you interact with,
Yeah.
right?
It's
Like,
taxing.
that's, man, yeah. And especially if you work in a setting where you're interacting with people throughout the day, and you're passing by this person, walking by that person, and to really feel like you're acting with purpose in those interactions, it's a very effortful thing.
It is
And
effortful. And what I
yeah,
can tell you though is that it does take a lot of effort. it's very hard to do, but you get better at it the more you do it. It's just like
Yeah,
building
yeah,
muscle, right? You
yeah,
build up the strength and the endurance to be able to give what you can. That's why, when I see some of these people who are these naturally giving souls and you feel super comfortable with those folks, yes, they worked at it probably, or they were natural, but I think to your point, you have to work at it. You have to
yeah,
practice it,
yeah.
right? You have to practice it. All right. Well, this has been unbelievable. You're super insightful and incredible, and I love you. And I do have a final question for you, though, before I
All
let you
right.
go. Um, who is someone you know that I don't know that I should meet?
Hmm. So I probably shouldn't name names. Would you? Are
You,
you gonna
you
like?
can you can name a name. It's just not your family. That's
Okay. Um, that's a good one. God, there's a lot of people that are coming to mind, but I have a friend who he's another Chris who I think would be a great conversation for you,
fantastic.
and um, he's also he's from Chicago and now in San Diego, and has had an interesting journey to get to this place. So he would be a good one.
Awesome. I'd love it.
Yeah,
I'd love it.
yeah.
All right. Well, listen, I will let you go. I love you, my friend, and blessings to your family. And thank you so much for being a part of this.
I love you, Chris. I love you, Spicy Milk. No, what was this? What was it? It
Not
wasn't
spicy
Spicy
milk.
Milk.
I'm chili milk because I'm
Chili
chilling
Milk.
cool.
Yeah, Chili Milk.
It's just pretty hilarious, right?
It's really good.
It's really
Really
good.
good.
All right, brother. I love you. Have a good night.
All right, you too, pal.
Well, all right, Andrew Melia. Wow, I love this conversation. It was so smooth and the transitions were so easy going from specific memories to larger ideas. Right? I mean, describing his dad as that independent spirit, that confidence, that sense of self, you can understand how Andrew has, a swagger about him, getting that from his pop, that belief of your sense of who you are and what man you want to be, and living as the man you are. So what do we learn from Andrew? Find out who you are. Be confident in who you are. If people don't like it, I don't know, fuck them. I mean, don't be an a-hole and treat people badly, but be yourself and figure out the man that you want to be. And if you live as the man you want to be, man, that's a lot of freedom in life. That's a lot of independence. It's a lot of confidence, and you can be yourself and project that onto others. Not a bad way to go. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I hope you enjoy this podcast. I hope you become a guest. Visit menfolkjourneys.com and book a conversation. Let's figure out your journey. Let's figure out the journey of your dad and how he influenced you. Gosh, thinking about how Andrew's dad influenced his whole perspective of how to live. And he's clearly going to be passing that on to his sons through the stories and through the way he goes about his daily life. And we can learn from him. I know we can learn from you too. Book a conversation at menfolkjourneys.com. I'd love to hear your story because we can all get better from learning from your lessons. Thank you for listening. Word Bit Filarid.